other seminars.
Right.
Maybe I share the screen rather than, yeah. As long as I can.
Sorry, Ian, are you saying you want to share your screen with your PowerPoint when you give your talk? Or
I think that's how it works, because unless I get control over the slides I've uploaded. Yeah.
Okay, no, I just want to make sure I didn't need to upload yours here. Okay, so we're good to go then.
Yeah, they are uploaded. Thanks.
Okay, good. Wait, but you're going to share your screen. Yes.
I think technically that's how it works. Yeah.
That's perfect. Okay, everybody. I have misplaced my time piece. It's okay. It's just I'd really like to know where my phone is. Anyway, welcome everybody, and I'm going to say this very sincerely. Thank you for coming. The first few academic presentations I ever gave were last session, and people didn't show up. I had two friends come to me one time and say, "Oh, Dan, I'd really like to hear your presentation, but I really need a beer." I was like, "Screw you, so do I." So very sincerely, thank you for coming. We have what I think is going to be a great presentation. Don't let me down, okay? And we're going to get right into it because we are running a little behind. The topic, the theme of today's session is an illusory divide between intoxicants and medicine, with a question mark, right? We're always interrogating those things. And we're going to just go in the order as they're listed. So we're going to start with Katie McLean, who's a PhD candidate from Montana State University. When global influencers become local influencers, Helen Howell Moorhead in Montana. And what we're going to do here is the speaker will come and sit by the computer with this mic. So there will be a little shuffling. Ian, you'll hear a little shuffling.
Switch out.
Do you have your water?
I didn't, but oh, it's okay. I'm good. Did we pop mine up?
It should be right at the bottom.
You can go to bed.
Oh yeah.
Or just Presentación.
This one? Oh, this
the
one?
white one. Yeah.
Perfect. I'm gonna take this off so you guys can hear. Okay, can you guys hear me okay? Perfect. Okay, I'll try not to go over. Thanks for coming. I'll echo that. Thank you for being here. I'm a PhD student at Montana State. My research interests center around drug controls from foreign policy down to the local level. I've spent my professional, farther away? Okay. Here, ¿está bien? Perfecto, gracias. I've spent my professional career working with the U.S. federal government for a long time, including the Justice Department and then the State Department. My time at State Department focused on human rights, rule of law, and drug policy in Latin America. And more recently, I've been doing consulting work in Montana with local communities on that fine overlap of justice and public health when it comes to substance use. So I do that on sort of the professional side, and then the academic piece. I'm kind of a non-traditional student coming back into academia later on. I'm a reformed political scientist, so I'm trying to put my historian hat on and really dive into historical analysis. So given my background, my dissertation started off focused more on foreign policy, but it quickly changed for a variety of reasons. Kids, pandemic, but also once I started doing archival research, which was new to me, I kind of just tried to see what was there. And I found some letters in the Montana Historical Society related to this woman, Helen Howell Moorhead, which is what I'm going to talk about today. And why talk about this? Why does Montana matter on this global setting where we're talking about so many things? To me, the question of who impacts policy is really fascinating. I've always liked digging into these issues of why are we where we are today? How did we get here? Who spoke the loudest and the most enticing to the public to convince them that this is how we should approach drugs and substance use in general? So Moorhead is known on the foreign policy circle. She's less known on influencing the domestic level. So that's what this chapter kind of dives into. Why Montana? It's not exactly a priority of early 20th century drug history, but it does matter. So it's still relevant. So if this is the map of the 1930s of the United States with population density, we might think of the American West as not being very populated. It was not. I'll have you look at Nevada. That's pretty interesting compared to what it is today with Las Vegas. But Montana did have some pockets, and a big chunk of development was happening in this time period in Montana. So the so what, as many scholars here talk about, cycles in drug use and drug policy happen. It's interesting to look at Montana as sort of a quieter place, but still playing out within these cycles. As David Courtwright tells us, what we think about drug addicts depends on who's addicted. And I'd love to add that what we think about addicts also depends on who has the power to engage with policymakers and funders. So like I said, this chapter today I'm talking about is this woman, Miss Moorhead's influence in the 1930s. I'm also looking at a second case study for Montana of a billionaire tech guy by the name of Tom Siebel, who started what's known as the Montana Meth Project in the 1990s. This is a continuing campaign in Montana on prevention of meth use. And it's a very intense public prevention campaign with sort of scare tactic methods, using billboards and TV ads, with sort of limited, when you look at the scholarly evaluations of its impact, showed sort of mixed outcomes of the impact of its kind of use as a prevention campaign. But it got this idea in people's heads that it was really powerful, and it got replicated in other states and funded other places. Like I said, this continues today, that case study. I'm not talking about that one today, but just again, the idea of like who influences what we fund and what we think about certain drugs and certain responses to drugs. So Montana in the 1930s, I've had to explain it to a few people where Montana is. I realize it's not a well-known place outside of the US, but if you watch popular TV and you've heard of the show Yellowstone, which is popular right now, maybe you think of Montana as a bunch of cowboys and ranchers. And yes, it still is that and was that in the 1930s. But Butte, Montana here in these pictures was known as a mining epicenter. In Western US history, if anyone writes about Montana, they often write about environmental impact of mining, and they write about the copper kings of Butte, Montana. A very interesting topic if you want to look into that on your own. But drugs were important and in the public sphere in the 1930s. Butte was kind of a wild town at that time. And so morphine use was an issue. This is a campaign ad for the county attorney that kind of highlights that. So drug use is relevant in this time. So enter this woman, Helen Howell Moorhead. She's vacationing in Montana in the mid-1930s. She is supposed to be on vacation, but she decides to take off her vacation hat and writes this op-ed for the Billings Gazette, meant to raise alarm. So she calls Montana a black spot on the narcotics map. She's arguing that doctors and druggists who are dispensing drugs in excessive quantities, they needed to be put under a lens of scrutiny by organizations like women's clubs, church groups, by all good citizens of Montana, she says. There's problems with the legal side of the question. The state wasn't prosecuting cases. She's saying perhaps because of bribery or political pressure. She was an educated elite woman from the high society circles of New York. She's not a local Montanan. She's a tourist there. M.L. Wilson, who was the Assistant Secretary of the U.S. Department of Agriculture, counted himself as a friend of hers and introduced her to some of the local political players at the state level. He writes to the governor introducing her before she comes out, saying she's one of the most ablest, most intelligent, and best balanced among the leading women of the nation who are contributing time and energy to the public welfare. So who is this woman? Why do we care about her? She comes up on the map. If you look into drug histories, she's here and there noted more for her foreign policy work. She went to Bryn Mawr, went on to study in Europe, lived a very high society life, was married to a doctor, and ended up at the Foreign Policy Association, which is really what she's known for. This is some quotes from Professor McAllister, who writes about her in his drug diplomacy book. talking about her as sort of this quiet, effective woman in policy circles. Not known for being super close with her family, not to dive too much into the biographical, but it's fun to read that stuff when you're digging through archives and find it in newspaper articles. So sort of a mixed background there on sort of, is she a family woman or is she more interested in her work, lends itself more towards that. So how did she come into this space? She was first exposed to the realities of drug addiction through volunteer work at the New York State Charities Aid Association, and was exposed to drug addicts on what was called Blackwell's Island in New York City. Prior to World War I, she volunteered there, and at the time, New York's penal system had a high number of drug addicts. Many were arrested for drug sale and possession, and were sent here and were often in withdrawal, especially from heroin and morphine. So she first was exposed there to sort of this idea of addiction and substance use. She would go on from there to work at the Red Cross National Headquarters during World War I, and then moved on from there to the Foreign Policy Association, which was a great fit with her background in sort of this high society New York. The association's mission was really centered on progressive era ideals about the adult education movement. So she had kind of done a little bit of this before, but they did a lot of outreach, speaking to different groups, writing op-ed type things, again, which we see later with the Montana case. And then they had this overlap with global narcotics and the Foreign Policy Association during the opium conventions. So this is sort of what she is known as. If she comes across in drug histories, it's often her work with the Foreign Policy Association and the opium conventions. So it all fit well together for her at this time when she came into it. And then she comes to Montana. It overflowed here with this vacation she's taking. She takes her skills at providing education to the general public and decides to broadcast her background and information she knows about in this op-ed. She writes that it's up to the people of Montana to find out why addiction is so out of control and doctors being these overprescribing to a lot of people and not being prosecuted for it. She calls drug addiction a communicable disease and says when addiction is fostered by doctors so debased that they have no regard for the health of the general community, when the list of cases prosecuted by the sworn defenders of the public will show such an inexplicable hiatus, when the integrity of the prosecuting bodies is brought in the picture, it's time to act. If not now, why not Montana? So she returns to Washington after this vacation to Montana. She went there for 2 different summers. And she starts raising the issue of this overprescribing of narcotics to federal leaders. There's a number of letters generated at this time that speak to all these conversations. She has the ear of a lot of high-level political officials, government leaders at the Department of Treasury. And I trace some specific cases in my chapter of like doctors and pharmacists that the Federal Bureau of Narcotics was tracking and wanted prosecuted but hadn't been. I won't dive into that here, but the basic premise is that Moorhead reaches out to the governor pointing to these high number of unprosecuted cases, both doctors and pharmacists. And then she goes on to loop Harry Anslinger, the head of the Bureau of Narcotics, and others at the Treasury Department. And she wants the governor to take down these doctors, basically, is what she's saying. She wants them to lose their licenses to practice. She wants the governor to also raise the alarm publicly through the use of women's clubs and social groups, this coming back to her sort of education mindset on prevention. So again, the foreign policy was very much about that education component, and she was very skilled at sort of engaging with the public in that capacity. So what's interesting to me, which I wasn't expecting, was sort of some of the literature I had read was women's clubs and women's groups were sort of kind of coming down from this hiatus after Prohibition of being very engaged and having less of an influence. But she really dives into the women's clubs across Montana and asks them sort of to come to call to arms. So they, in one of their newsletters during this time period, their director writes about they're expanding their understanding of what substance use and the narcotics problem in Montana looks like. And this director writes to the group, when in Washington, I contacted the Commissioner of Narcotics, Anslinger, and find these appalling facts about Montana, that Montana has 25 places where the records show an unusual amount of narcotics sold, has 299 addicts listed, which in proportion to its population is pretty bad. The states around Montana have a few addicts listed, and Minnesota, with the much larger population, has 216 addicts. So she is pushing for within the women's clubs to sort of engage, understand the issues, do something locally within their communities. She says, what are you doing in your towns about checking this evil? Keep your eyes open, report what you find. Federal aid will be given to any prosecutions, but the case must be brought in Montana first. And it's up to the mothers to be on alert and doing something about it. So again, more heads calling them to arms. She's basically encouraging to lock up these doctors or kick them out of their practices. So some of the records kind of run cold after the one governor steps out of office. He was the one that was kind of engaged with her the most and pushing to do some things. Montana would go on to adopt the Uniform Narcotic Drug Act in 1937. And the full impact of her op-ed and sort of this push follow-up that she had becomes clearer in the next year, at least by her own account. She shares with some of the women's clubs that prosecutions, that the violations of laws regulating the sale of narcotics decreased in 1937 compared to 1936, from 36 registered violations to just 4. But while they're focused on these doctors and pharmacists, seems to have an impact. There's all these unregistered violations of the Narcotics Act. So if doctors can no longer easily prescribe pain medicine to patients, it becomes a black market issue. So these stats are small, I realize, in the big scheme of things. But the importance of her work, in my mind, is how she keeps this issue at the forefront of the public dialogue. So she keeps the pressure of prescription drug use in the news, in the conversations socially through these women's groups and sort of her high society circles, her connections with political leaders back in DC and New York. And then again, this idea that outreach to women's clubs, particularly in American West history, the role of white women in the West holding power of influence over these structures in society. So churches, schools, social clubs, keeping check on social ills like alcohol, gambling, and drug use. This is written about a lot in the American West, of sort of this idea of white women coming in and kind of making the frontier friendlier. So this is a little bit of a change of that, but a sort of continuation of that idea. So yeah, my conclusion really is this role of outsiders influencing inside issues, particularly in cases in states not as well written about like Montana, and the power that those people can play in policy circles and on the social level. And I'll leave it there.
Someone else 5 extra minutes.
Hey. Yeah, you're welcome.
No, I'm not going to abuse it.
I'm just going to get into the microphone.
Oh, go ahead.
Just want to, so people online can hear. Okay, that was nice. Thank you. Our next, this is awkward. Our next paper is from Ryu Yokoe. Did I mess it up?
That's fine.
Jeez, man, I just asked you. Yokoe, sorry. He's a postdoc at the University of Tokyo. Do not pay any attention to the other thing that's after his name because he strikes it off anything he sees. Take it away.
Thank you very much. So I'll try to stay within time, even if you generously left us some few more minutes. But is this a good? Yeah. Okay. So thanks for having me. My name is Ryoko, as Stan kindly introduced me. I basically work on my PhD thesis was on liver disease and kind of the causal changing kind of historical understandings on the medical knowledge on the causal relationships between alcohol consumption and cirrhosis of the liver. So in today's paper, I'd like to examine the nature of industry funding in alcohol research through a particular case from Britain in the early 1980s, when the brewing industry took interest in a group of clinical studies on alcohol and liver disease led by Dr. Roger Williams, that's the guy on the right. As one of the leading authorities in liver disease research at the time, Williams and his team of medical scientists looked into the predisposing role of heredity and sex in facilitating the development of cirrhosis, the most serious stage of alcoholic liver disease. The decision by the brewers to sponsor these studies occurred against the backdrop of a growing recognition, basically, that alcohol misuse should be dealt with as a public health issue amidst the steep rise of problem drinking in the 1970s in the United Kingdom. based on previously unexplored internal records of the Brewers Society, which was at the time the most powerful brewing association in Britain. This paper explores how the industry responded to such developments in the alcohol debate and what they sought to gain from funding Williams. So the ethics of industry funding is a kind of a messy topic, I think. So the harmful role of industry science funding has been well documented by academics in a variety of topics, including something like climate change and the role of the oil industry. And it concerns basically a lot of the literature talks about the harms and benefits brought about by the very commodity that the industry produces for profit. So in my case, I'm talking about alcohol and the brewing industry. Of course, there's a lot of literature on the tobacco industry and the dismissal of cancer risks, fabrication of evidence on its health benefits throughout the 20th century. And probably the most interesting one for me, at least, is a 1960s Harvard study that singled out fat as a risk to heart disease. And this study turned out to be funded by the sugar industry. So just to summarize some of the arguments before I get into the main points. The brewing industry took interest in research that highlighted factors other than alcohol itself in causing liver cirrhosis. And this was mainly to reduce their blame in the growing incidence of alcohol-related diseases, including cirrhosis deaths in the 1970s and 80s in Britain. Nevertheless, they funded legitimate lines of research that actually stressed the complex nature of alcohol's relationship with the liver, which was at the time a perspective that was very underappreciated in medicine. And overall, I guess the point of this presentation is that individual cases of industry funding, I think, must be placed in their historical contexts to fully grasp their complex circumstances and motivations. So part of what I'm aiming to do is to add to the literature in British history on alcohol and public health, which discusses how the industry used political lobbying and PR, mainly public relations, to engage with the policy debate, but not so much on what they did in the realm of science and medicine. And in doing so, I'm also highlighting the centrality of specialized medical knowledge, professional medical knowledge and research in the wider politics of alcohol, and show that medical expertise was at the very heart of the resurgent debates on alcohol and health in the late 20th century. And this is kind of the outline of what I'm going to do. I'm going to start with the context of the state of the alcohol problem in 1980s Britain. So the 1970s especially, I kind of started in the mid-60s, but especially in the 70s saw a sustained growth in per capita alcohol consumption. Per capita alcohol consumption, by the way, for those who might not be familiar with, is basically how much alcohol is actually consumed by the population from the 1970s onwards. So this is the graph of what I just mentioned, and you can see in the red square that's around the late 60s, 70s, and the beginning of the 80s, there's a sudden rapid rise in alcohol consumption in the United Kingdom. And this was caused by a variety of things. So a big one is the growth of disposable incomes right after the Second World War with the post-war economic boom. The gradual liberalization of licensing laws after the war. So a big change in the 60s was that supermarkets could now sell alcohol, which previously they couldn't. An increase in alcohol consumption among women, which of course raises the average alcohol consumption rates in the whole population. And overall, this trend led to a rising incidence of alcohol-related problems, which includes a variety of things like, traffic accidents, and of course, and in this paper, I'm mostly talking about liver disease incidents and also deaths. And basically, in reaction to this, we see the rise of an alliance of medical and psychiatric professionals in the United Kingdom demands stricter regulations to tackle the problem as a public health issue. And this was based on a kind of a social science model called the total consumption model, which was promoted by the well-known Purple Book in 1975, which was a WHO report, a transnational kind of effort to outline new kind of policy approaches to alcohol. This was kind of based on a statistical kind of causal association between three things. So one being the availability of alcohol, which is kind of the cost of alcohol, which if the availability goes up, the per capita consumption of alcohol goes up. And if that goes up, the incidence of alcohol problems, including cirrhosis, goes up as well. So therefore, the Public Health Alliance basically concluded that an effective alcohol policy should aim to reduce per capita consumption by restricting the availability of alcohol itself. So this involved higher taxes on alcohol, so alcohol would be more expensive, tougher licensing laws, and a ban on alcohol adverts. So basically, I mean, the big picture is that the public health movement problematized the consumption of alcohol itself as something that, so all drinking should be reduced in order to reduce the harm that's done in a minority of the population. And yes, I targeted all forms of drinking. Of course, the alcoholic beverage industry opposed these policy calls, tougher controls to protect beverage, basically because they were concerned about their own sales numbers. Especially, they were opposed to higher taxes, obviously. And kind of the vanguard of this whole opposition to the public health movement was the Brewers Society, which was a kind of a trade lobby group established all the way back in 1904. To represent the interests of the UK brewing industry as a whole. Initial strategies in their institutional histories basically included political lobbying, but a lot of interesting PR campaigns to promote, reshape the image of beer and so forth. But however, from the 1970s, they became gradually more interested in influencing medicine and health because, of course, public health was based on a lot of medical arguments, and they wanted to try to steer that debate for their own benefits. And overall, they disputed the total consumption model to oppose the public health-backed regulations that targeted all drinking by reducing per capita consumption. And instead, they argued for policies that targeted a minority of drinkers, so who engage in alcohol misuse and abuse. And one of their way of contributing to the alcohol debate was they instead of the kind of tax-based ban on adverts, public health policies, they preferred educational methods as an alternate strategy to encourage sensible drinking. And this was mainly for publicity, so that the industry could be seen to be as if they're doing something to tackle the problem. So just to summarize, so the public health movement called for higher taxes, tougher licensing laws to safeguard public health. On the other hand, the brewing industry, they saw higher taxes, tougher licensing as a threat to sales. And the public health movement targeted all drinking by supporting the reduction of the whole consumption of alcohol. In opposition to that, the brewing industry opposed policies that targeted the reduction of all drinking and instead supported health education as the way to tackle specific kinds of problem drinking. So I'd like to move on to the character I mentioned at the very beginning, Roger Williams, and his liver disease research. So before we move on to that, just kind of 101 on liver disease, some basic facts about it. So the liver is the largest internal organ in the body and plays an essential role in metabolism. And there are basically 3 stages of alcoholic liver disease. There's fatty liver, which is kind of an immediate, kind of acute reaction to alcohol consumption. When that continues for several years, you might have hepatitis. And the worst stage is cirrhosis, when the liver basically become covered in scars and nodules. And at that stage, so fatty liver and hepatitis, if you stop drinking, the likelihood of recovering your liver is actually quite high. But when you get to cirrhosis, it's hard to go back, and that's when your mortality rate goes down. But interestingly, cirrhosis of the liver is actually prevalent in only about 20 to 30% of heavy drinkers. So only a minority of drinkers develop cirrhosis, get to the 3rd stage of liver disease. And yes, the majority of drinkers would never develop cirrhosis, no matter how much they drink. So in the 1980s, the basic knowledge on cirrhosis. So in the 70s, alcohol was confirmed to be the direct cause of cirrhosis by a set of experiments by an American doctor called Charles Lieber in New York. And this basically cemented this idea that, yes, it seems like liver disease is directly caused by alcohol. But there was one big unanswered question at the time. And that's related to the point I made before about the only a minority. So how come cirrhosis never develops in more than a minority of heavy drinkers? How come? What are the factors that lead to this minority getting cirrhosis but not the majority? So the scientists basically move on to studying factors other than alcohol itself that might play a role in the development of cirrhosis. And there's increasing interest in inborn factors like genetics and sex as predispositions to cirrhosis. And Roger Williams was the main researcher that spearheaded the research into these predispositions at the time. He passed away 2 years ago, but he was a leading authority on liver disease that was based in King's College Hospital in London. And in 1964, he basically became quite famous for performing the first successful liver transplant in the UK. And in 1973, he established the first dedicated research and treatment unit for liver disease in Britain. And I want to kind of very briefly summarize what he did in terms of research on genetics and sex as inborn factors to cirrhosis. So in terms of genetics, Lever looked into the possible role of genetically determined immune responses to cirrhosis. And he discovered that patients who had what's called the HLA-B8 serotype had a 50% higher risk of developing cirrhosis over those who did not. So basically, he was able to isolate the specific gene that correlated with cirrhosis. He also looked into the sexual predispositions to cirrhosis. So basically, he noticed that women showed significantly higher incidence of cirrhosis than men, and much more with also much poorer prognosis after getting cirrhosis. And this was based on the recent explosion in the number of women receiving liver disease treatments after the 1970s, increased quite significantly because of the rising consumption of alcohol among women. And his specific research on cirrhosis and gender actually influenced the separate drinking guidelines for men and women. So at the time, men were suggested that they were able to drink a bit more than women by the public health guidelines in the 1970s and 80s. And why is this significant? So initially, in the beginning of the 70s, it was, the kind of the old causal model when it comes to liver disease was that alcohol causes cirrhosis. It was a fairly straightforward causal model. However, with Williams's research, but also other scholars too, they considered the role of other risk factors such as gender predisposition, genetic predisposition, but also immunological and metabolic differences between different individuals. And this was part of a wider shift in medicine from what's called monocausality, which is the above model, to multifactorialism, which is a consideration of many different factors that might cause an illness. And of course, yes, the biggest contribution, I think, is it basically highlighted how complex alcohol's causal action was to the liver. And this was in response to a much more simplified earlier model. And I'd like to now move on to why the Brewers Society actually funded Williams. So why did they find this research interesting enough to fund it? And actually, it's not just that, it's kind of a complicated story. So in the 1970s, the Brewers Society established what's called a medical advisory committee, a committee of professional physicians to advise the industry on medical matters in the 1970s. And they specifically reported to a guy called Derek Holden Brown, who was the chairman of the Brewers Society. So he was actually in charge. He was an industry member who was in charge of the organization. He suggested to the committee that the society should actually fund Williams's research project. So he brought in Williams's he introduced Williams to the committee to saying that this is the kind of research that we like to fund. And the personal kind of reasons why this happened was, so Holden Brown was also a chairman of the Allied Lions Brewery, which was at the time one of the largest brewery companies in Britain. His corporate superior, the CEO of Allied Lions, was a different guy called Keith Showering. And Keith Showering also happened to be a former patient and a friend of Roger Williams. And so personal connections basically led to the facilitation of this funding. And the context was that the liver unit, which was led by Williams, was desperate for funding in the late 1970s because there was not a lot of public money available for liver disease research at the time. And the extent of funding was actually quite significant. So Williams was funded between 1980 and 1983 as the largest beneficiary among all projects supported by the Brewers Society. There were many other projects too, like educational research projects, but Williams's research was the largest beneficiary. It was £107,000 in total, which, right, if you adjust it to inflation, it's about £400,000, which doesn't sound like a lot if you think about it, because scientific research costs a lot of money. But at the time, it was still an exploratory thing for the Brewers Society. And this actually made up 32% of the society's entire research funds. So it's actually quite significant in 1980. However, the medical advisory committee that I mentioned before cut off the funding in 1983. So it was supposed to go to, I think, 1984. So there was one more year left, but they actually cut off the funding. And this was because they argued that Williams was, quote, drawing a disproportionate share of the research funds available. So it was just too generous from their view. So they actually recommended at some point to cut off the funding. So I'm going to get into the kind of the scientific reasons why the Medical Advisory Committee and the Brewers Society, by extension, actually found Williams's research quite interesting. So this is a minute of meeting from 1979 that basically outlined Williams's research and kind of talked about the benefits of his research and its implications to the brewing industry. So, quote, with such techniques, it should be possible to evolve procedures for determining what is safe for an individual to drink without developing liver damage, to separate patients into a high-risk group who develops severe liver disease and a low-risk group in which the effect does not occur. And it is hoped that this approach would form the basis for a blood test to screen patients for serious liver injury. So what this means is basically the goal was to develop possible means, likely means to isolate specific individuals who are more susceptible to cirrhosis and actually corner them out. And the most important part to the industry was this actually allowed the rest of the drinking population to continue drinking. And also to strengthen the narrative that only a specific, easily identifiable group of people are at risk of cirrhosis, i.e. public health policies that push for the reduction of all drinking that I mentioned before, they argued unnecessarily disadvantages those who aren't at risk of illness. There are other reasons for, I mean, there's also, they argue that also funding this project could bring substantial benefits such as useful publicity for the industry and the support of a prominent doctor whose attitude was favorable towards the industry. So basically, having a doctor on your side, legitimizes some of the claims that the industry wanted to make, especially against the public health movements. So like, what do we take of this? So, I mean, I talked about the personal ties that, Williams was able to get the funding through his friendship with Showering, who was a superior to Holden Brown, who run the society. So personal ties between Williams and the executive members certainly played a role. I mean, there's no doubt about it. But at the same time, the internal minutes of the society show that its members paid very, very close attention to the content of Williams's scientific research, but also his policy implications. So I'd like to end with some concluding thoughts. So I think the big question that left me, especially as a historian of science, was the question of whether there was actual funding bias in Williams's research. So, I mean, there's a lot of literature on this, of course, that industry money is generally shown to heavily bias research questions, experimental design, research outputs, and so on in pharmaceutical research. However, having read all of the papers that Williams actually published in the periods that was funded by that actually acknowledged the society's funding, I saw no actual evidence of self-censorship or overt lip service to the industry's interests in his articles. And this probably suggested that the money actually didn't come with any conditions on part of Williams. And even actually one of his Brewers Society funded articles in 1981 suggested that alcohol sales should be restricted in supermarkets to avoid the further growth of health problems, which obviously directly goes against industry interests. So I think I concluded here that he likely went for the money, knowing that his research specifically highlighted an underexplored aspect of cirrhosis and would be seen favorably by drinks companies because of the actual implications. But the implications are scientifically, I think, legitimate. So we have to kind of, I think, contextualize this. I'll be almost done. Yeah. So I think individual cases of industry funding must be historicized to fully grasp the circumstances and motivations that underlay them. And alcohol industry funding did not actually, I think in the historiography at least, well, actually, no, not the historiography, did not receive anywhere near the same amount of hostility in the early 1980s as it does today. And the big turning point in the UK, at least, was the Portman Group scandal that happened in 1994, which the Portman Group is a successor to the Brewers Society that was found to be funding a huge amount of very biased research in Edinburgh at the time. And of course, there are similar kind of historiographical debates around the tobacco lung cancer controversy. And I assume some of you probably were thinking about that separate debate while you were watching this presentation. But so older accounts, of course, portray the industry kind of as a sort of a villain in the story. But more recent accounts, like Virginia Berridge's recent book, not recent, but it's quite a while back, book in 2007, actually provide a more complex narrative of the situation that, sometimes they actually funded quite legitimate objections to the epidemiological link between lung cancer and tobacco smoking. So just to conclude, the Brewers Society funded legitimate research into an underappreciated aspect of alcohol's complex relationship to the liver that actually went beyond the straightforward causation of alcohol. They didn't actually fabricate scientific falsehoods. And actually, they were quite clear in the minutes that they acknowledged that cirrhosis was a direct outcome of drinking. They actually saw that as indisputable. At the same time, this research was actually seen to benefit the society's interest because of its implications, and it downplayed the responsibility of alcohol itself, and by extension, the brewing industry in the growing incidence of liver disease. And it was also believed to support the idea that only a minority of drinkers were at risk of developing cirrhosis and other alcohol-related problems, which invalidated public health policies that introduced all drinking instead of targeting alcohol misuse and abuse. And it is based on these conclusions, as well as my case study, that I argue that expert knowledge on alcohol-related illnesses played a central role in shaping public discussions on alcohol and harm. Thank you very much.
Thank you,
Thank
Rio.
you.
Just sit down here for a second to introduce Chef.
Awesome. Okay. Our third speaker is Patricia McCourt. She is a PhD candidate because you just finished your comps.
Yeah, my proposal. Yes.
Yeah, her proposal has been approved, so congratulations. And she's she's from Mississippi State University, and she's speaking on a narcotized group. Oh, new word. A narcotized group troubling the distinction between medical and non-medical female drug users in the Gilded Age and Progressive Era. Let's see if we can find it here. If I can even see a mouse, I can. Come on, you want to try to find it? Someone's gonna have to find it. Where is it? That's that. That's this. There. That says McCourt. That's good.
Wonderful. And then the white button up here should work.
Oh, I can do this
Or you
too.
can do it that way.
Presentación de tortillas.
Awesome.
Ding.
Great. Great.
Got it.
Okay. And thank you all so much for coming. And I'm just gonna jump right into it. Oh, that's right. All right, so again, title of the paper, A Narcotized Group, Troubling the Distinction Between Medical and Non-Medical Female Drug Users in the Gilded Age and Progressive Era. So in her 1902 autobiographical piece, 8 Years in Cocaine Hell, Annie C. Myers offered readers a grave warning about the depths to which drugs could pull a woman. Myers described herself as an attractive and well-respected Chicago socialite, even granted the honor of sitting on a committee for the 1893 World's Fair. Her life changed forever, though, when she first ingested cocaine. Her use started out innocently enough. Quote, in 1894, while attending to some legal matters, my lawyer, who noticed I was suffering from a severe cold, advised me to try Bernie's Catarrh Remedy. He gave me a bottle, and that started me on my downward course, Myers explained. Within a couple of months, she was on the run, forging checks and shoplifting thousands of dollars in merchandise from department stores in several major cities. Homeless, emaciated, and in a, quote, state of imbecility, Myers thought of nothing but how she might score her next dose of cocaine for 8 long years. Fortunately, when she had hit rock bottom, in jail for the umpteenth time and bound for the insane asylum, O.E. Miller, a wealthy philanthropist in charge of the St. Luke's Society, arranged for her release and started her on the path back to sobriety. Myers' story was exceptional in many regards. Local police gave her multiple free passes. Her well-off sister opened her home whenever she came through town. And this harrowing tale might have ended with a lynching rather than a rescue had she been a black man. Nevertheless, a central theme woven through 8 years in cocaine hell is that addiction is no respecter of social status, that narcotics could quickly level distinctions between the respectable and the depraved. So I've included 3 photographs from the text. On the left, Myers is pictured after using cocaine for just about a year. And in the middle, she's pictured on the day of her release. She claimed that it was, quote, impossible to give readers any idea of the frightful condition I was in during my stay at the Bridewell. This photograph was taken a few days after my release, and it flatters my real appearance at the time. My hair was mostly out, a part of my upper jawbone had rotted away, my teeth were entirely gone, my face and my entire body were a mass of putrefying cocaine ulcers. I weighed only about 80 pounds, and it would be hard to conceive of a more repulsive sight. The photograph on the right was taken shortly before the publication of this book, illustrating her miraculous recovery. So we might look at Annie C. Myers as sort of a precursor to the Montana Meth Project, right? Some pretty fear-mongering images. So when describing drug use and addiction in the late 19th and early 20th century United States, it has long been customary for scholars to distinguish medical from non-medical users. The former category refers to persons who first obtained a narcotic, typically some form of opiate or cocaine, from a physician. The latter refers to users who obtain their supply without a prescription, presumably seeking out a drug for its psychoactive effects rather than to treat a painful disease or condition. Contemporaries and later pioneering historians managed to sketch a demographic portrait of each group to reveal that the former comprised mostly middle and upper class white women, while the latter tended to contain a much more diverse cast of poor and working class users, namely Chinese immigrants, sex workers, and single white men in urban centers. While these categories are a useful framing device for understanding the aim and impact of federal narcotic regulation, cultural attitudes surrounding and representations of addiction throughout this dynamic era seldom diverged into such neat compartments. Female users during this time, both those holding a prescription and those without, present an excellent case study for examining parallels in the treatment and depiction of drug use and its consequences across both literally and socially distant spaces. Though respectable women often garnered pity as victims of unscrupulous physicians, responses also included a fair amount of condemnation and pathologizing. Conversely, female non-medical addicts who might have socialized in Chinese opium dens or depended on patent medicines were not always objects of ridicule and disgust. Instead of victims at the hands of the medical profession, reformers often published seduction narratives wherein traffickers employed potent drugs to kidnap and enslave a once virtuous girl. In this paper, I will demonstrate that American society's portrayal of women's drug use held many common threads, which demonstrate assumptions regarding the essential nature of femininity. What results from these varied narratives is a paradoxical lack of agency due to women's inherent vulnerability to the forces of evil in a rapidly modernizing world, in this case an unregulated narcotics market, coupled with their inherent virtuosity, which seem crucial to social harmony, but also in need of constant protection. Perhaps the most condemnatory statements regarding women's drug use, especially in the first few decades following the Civil War, came from organs with a female target audience. While prominent theorists like Alonzo Calkins and Thomas Crothers laid the blame at physicians' feet for the increase in opiate addiction, by the 1880s, some middle-class women expected would-be victims to know better. In this view, sensible housewives held the responsibility of actively avoiding developing a habit. In a column entitled Poisons, Good Housekeeping contributor Ella Guernsey offered a list of do's and don'ts on how to store and handle harmful chemicals, from cleaning supplies to medicines. Quote, "Do please pause before becoming enslaved to the quinine or morphine habit," she advised, offering a pathetic example of what might become of a housewife should she blindly follow her doctor's orders. A delicate, refined wife and mother was ordered by her medical attendant to take small capsules filled with quinine. The doses were increased with size, and then she could not do without it. Years have slipped by, Guernsey concluded, and today thin and frail with shaking hands, she daily measures out a teaspoon filled with quinine, declaring she is fit for nothing until she takes her tonic. Here, in a rather cold, almost self-loathing manner, we can see bourgeois female writers reclaiming agency for themselves while also managing to stigmatize habitual drug use, even if medical in origin. An advice column published in an 1892 issue of the Ladies' Home Journal is particularly revealing. One woman wrote in, referencing a previous article, wherein the author described her husband as the perfect man, virtually without faults. Rather tongue-in-cheek, she asked Aunt Patience, the advice column author, if readers might learn of just one flaw that this supposedly perfect man possessed. Aunt Patience gave a stern response. No, let us not ask for his faults. There are real live men whose patience with fretfulness, whose tenderness with weakness, whose unfailing devotion to unworthiness makes them heroes, she chided. With a sharp pivot, the columnist then chose drug addiction as an illustrative example for why women ought not to claim any moral high ground over men. I know of one man who for more than a score of years has shielded his wife whose moral and physical life has been eaten out by the morphine habit. He suffers miseries untold for her sake. We cannot claim all virtues for womanhood. Similarly to Guernsey, Aunt Patience had little sympathy or patience for ladies who burdened their families with their drug use. By this point in time, prescription narcotics were becoming closely associated with intemperance. In turn, intemperance made the ultimate mockery of feminine virtuosity. Shifting our attention from drug use in the domestic sphere, portrayals of female users in public spaces are equally complicated. In an attempt to explain how and why women tended to be more susceptible to developing a drug habit, G. Frank Lydeston echoed writers like Annie C. Myers in warning of the rapid transformation users underwent after their first dose of a narcotic. Quote, the dangers of opium in woman are even greater than in man. To obtain the drug, she will descend to the very depths of depravity, he argued in his 1904 tract, The Diseases of Society. I remember on one occasion seeing a narcotized group composed of several Chinamen, a supposedly reputable woman, 2 prostitutes, and a boy of 16 huddled together in a most promiscuous fashion. Opium smoking stirred up reformers' deepest fears of a disordered society. That is, it had the capacity to collapse lines between race, class, sex, and even age. What's striking about this passage is that the reputable woman likely did not start out smoking opium. It was only after her craving became unmanageable, perhaps cut off by her physician or running low on funds, that she descended to the very depths of depravity for a quick fix. If a nervous and frail housewife occupied one end of the drug use spectrum, a miserable sex worker occupied the other extreme. According to several white slavery crusaders, and in the popular imagination more generally, drugs were closely connected to prostitution as both a precursor to and a result of engaging in this line of work. In a sensationalist tract published in 1912 titled From Dance Hall to White Slavery, the reform-minded authors offered familiar seduction tales where drugs played a crucial role. Quote, under the influence of this drug, she is a mark at the hands of the den keepers. As the effects of the drugs die out, she craves for more. For several weeks, she may be kept in this state. She is maudlin and resents no liberties taken with her. Though far more toned down, official reports on sex trafficking considered drugs and alcohol indispensable to a woman's capture. In his 1909 study, Importing Women for Immoral Purposes, Immigration Commissioner William Paul Dillingham proclaimed, intoxication and drugging are often resorted to as a means to reduce the victim to a state of helplessness, and sheer physical violence is a common thing. So the diagram here is included in the first couple pages of From Dance Hall to White Slavery. And as you can see, the authors drew a direct link between narcotics and sex trafficking. One also encounters surprisingly compassionate, albeit pitiful, portrayals of both drug use and sex work in progressive era literature. Take Upton Sinclair's The Jungle, for example. This classic piece of muckraking offered more than just an expose of Chicago's grotesque meatpacking facilities. Readers follow a family of Lithuanian immigrants and the unbearable hardships they face trying to establish a life for themselves in the United States. The main character, Jurgis Rudkis, discovers his deceased wife's cousin, Maria, working in a brothel just to help feed the family's children after he'd become an alcoholic and abandoned them. In the process, she became addicted to morphine. When asked if she could quit and why she started in the first place, Maria gave a dejected response. "It's the way of it. I don't know why. If it isn't that, it's drink," she told Jurgis. "If the girls didn't booze, they couldn't stand it any time at all. And the madam always gives them dope when they first come, and they learn to like it. Or else they take it for headaches and such things, and get the habit that way. I've got it. I know. I've tried to quit, but I never will while I'm here." Though morphine came to be Maria's drug of choice, her compatriots had various means at hand for drowning sorrows. She pointed Jurgis's attention to a young French woman across the room who had been ruined after her predatory factory foreman had, quote, put dope in her food, then proceeded to pimp her out, keeping her locked in the same room for 10 months. The man finally sent her away because after a while she didn't suit. "I guess they'll put her out of here too," Maria remarked. "She's getting to have crazy fits from drinking absinthe." An avowed socialist intending to portray working class strife in the most sympathetic light possible, Upton Sinclair's apparent attitude towards drug-using sex workers may have been far from typical. Nevertheless, his decision to incorporate Maria's tragic fate within the story is not without significance. It comes back to agency. Sinclair, like most commentators on sex work at the time, could not conceive of a woman who independently decided to perform this kind of labor. And additionally, these women did not take drugs by their own free will either, at least not at first. Drugs functioned in this story and others as tools of conniving madams and rapists to stupefy and enslave young women. They also served as a tool for victims, once entrapped in a life of prostitution, to dull both the physical and psychological pain that came with the job. Maria's habitual drug use, as well as the unnamed French sex workers, signaled their resignation to a life they did not choose. This all being said, the medical-non-medical binary did emerge for a legitimate reason. As historian Timothy Hickman demonstrated in his book, The Secret Leprosy of Modern Days, several contemporaries actively policed this distinction. In so doing, they paved the way for the classical era of narcotic control, wherein those with sufficient resources and social status received medical attention, and those without faced incarceration. William Rosser Cobb claimed in his 1895 tract, Dr. Judas, a portrayal of the opium habit, for example, that users, quote, users who take the drug into the circulation or by injection never form the habit by deliberate purpose. They are tied hand and foot by the physician, or they are led into it by racking physical pain at a time when they are not morally responsible for their conduct. The smoker of opium becomes such through wantonness of desire. While commentators like Cobb did indeed speak of two classes of addicts, these categories were by no means mutually exclusive. Rather, anti-narcotic activists tended to view the different modes of drug use on a sliding scale, with unwitting patients on one end and depraved fiends on the other. A first-time morphine or cocaine user could, in time, fall to the depths of the most loathsome addict, with abundant patent medicines and unscrupulous physicians or pharmacists stationed all along the way to facilitate that spiral. Prescription-holding users were never fully insulated from the scorn directed at the underworld. Another dilemma wrapped up in employing these categories is that it leaves no room for exploring self-medication at times when doing so was perfectly legal. Coming back to Annie C. Meyer's story, consumers could wittingly or unwittingly purchase narcotics and continue usage without ever consulting a physician. One finds few references to this behavior, however, and even fewer confessions, and understandably so. A woman deciding of her own free will to alter her state of consciousness did not align with any of the fantastic figures, to borrow Nancy Campbell's term, circulating in medical and lay discourse at the time. There had to be some underlying pathology, physical, psychological, or environmental, that drove them to this point, if one were to follow the logic of the historical actors highlighted in this paper. Drawing comparisons between drug usage in and outside the medical context has some obvious limits. Well-to-do patients holding a prescription could more easily conceal their habit in a private setting, unlike some of their working-class counterparts. Although their usage garnered much criticism, The penalties with which they dealt tended only to be discursive in nature. And when I say that, I mean from a social aspect. I'm not talking about the very real consequences of addiction, right? Gastrointestinal issues, nosebleeds, right? The very real risk of overdose. But yes, they tended only to be discursive in nature. Those using outside the home, however, eventually became the primary targets of law enforcement and held fewer privileges in general. Scholars should resist the urge to read this fate backward into the pre-regulation era, though. In order for respectable ladies to dodge punitive drug policy, their usage had to be stigmatized and assimilated into more seedy depictions so as to make a truly feminine and virtuous addict unthinkable. Importantly, the mixed responses to women's narcotic use in the Gilded Age and Progressive Era further illustrate the crucial connections between gender and addiction that scholars such as Nancy Campbell, Elizabeth Ettore, and Tammy Anderson have deftly identified. Many of the stories at the turn of the century Americans told about women's drug use, even those written by women, had a way of either condemning individuals' behavior or erasing their agency altogether. In dissecting these narratives, we can better understand the role that gender discourse played in the criminalization of narcotics and avoid reinforcing the same tropes that lie at the very heart of them. Thank you. Right, 18 minutes. Let's go.
Yeah. Oh, you're timing yourself. Yeah. Okay, awesome. Thank you. Thank you, Patricia. Our next speaker, our next presenter, I'd like to say should be known to everyone, but he's there, so now you know him. It's Ian Smith. Ian, what are you doing at University of Glasgow these days?
I'm an honorary clinical senior lecturer, so I teach medical students about the perils of alcohol. I have a week of teaching on liver disease, alcohol brain damage.
Awesome. Okay.
So I've still got a foot in the door there. No longer doing my history research, but.
So I was going to say something like transition by saying, after hearing about all those evil doctors, we're going to hear from one who talks to not so evil doctors, physicians. So Ian, you have 20 minutes. Take it away.
Thank you. Am I able to share screen?
I think you should be able to, yeah.
Let's see.
Yeah, it's able. You can share.
Yes.
Okay. Oh. I think it's asking me to give permission to share.
If a Mac is going to get permission from the system operating system.
Oh dear.
Let's see if I have it here.
Allow Zoom to share your screen. So, okay. And I'm trying to tick a box that it won't allow me to tick. Oh dear. I have, hang on.
Ian, I have your presentation here. If you're having trouble, you can just tell me when to switch.
Let me try this, and then if this doesn't work,
okay.
Let's see if this works now.
You're a gamer. That was good.
Does that work?
We see it.
Yes,
you
sir.
Can see it. We're in. Okay, great.
Right.
Thank you. Yeah, great sessions so far. I'll try not to let the side down. It was good to see Roger Williams. I knew Roger Williams. He spoke at a conference I organized 3 years ago. Really great speaker. And he was practicing in Harley Street and King's College Hospital right up until his death. Also famous for treating a very famous footballer called George Best. and looking after him through 2 liver transplants, but it didn't end well. Anyway, onto my talk. So the other end organ that alcohol can affect is the brain. And so I'm going to talk about alcoholic insanity and why I think 19th century psychiatrists misattributed a lot of insanity to alcohol. We do not now believe what they believed, maybe a bit of a truism, and I realize I'm getting into anachronistic territory in amongst historians. So I'm a consultant psychiatrist treating drug addicts and alcohol addicts in Stirling now. I used to work in Glasgow. And I think with this talk, I have stripped bare through several ADHS conferences my MD thesis, which you can look up online, and chapters on delirium tremens, alcohol insanity, doctors' involvement in alcohol policy in the 19th century in Scotland. A whiskey-injured nation was the term that a temperance advocate had for Scotland. In Scotland, 90% of alcohol was consumed as whiskey, unlike in England, where 90% of alcohol was consumed as beer in the late 19th century. So I'm a psychiatrist, and I have an interest in history of my own discipline. And I was puzzled by the idea of alcoholic insanity, because it's not something that is common. Persistent alcohol insanity is a rare thing, a condition called alcohol hallucinosis. So Edward Shorter, a historian of psychiatry, said in Britain, psychiatry was steeped in alcohol. It is evident that in the second half of the 19th century, pathological drinking became a problem of considerable psychiatric proportions. And he was thinking about the impact on the asylum. And the asylum wasn't really a treatment facility for what we would now call alcohol dependence. It took what they called the insane or lunatics, this rather amorphous term of lunacy or insanity, which was enshrined in mental health legislation of the time. So I come from a nation that has, we heard from Alice Major yesterday about the Irish and drink, but the Scots are also in the spotlight for being having a love of alcohol, although that probably changed in the 20th century for several decades, where temperance won through. I think the most drunken nation on earth in Victorian times, 19th century, was France. But you can ask me if we have time why I think that at the end. So what about psychiatry in Glasgow, where I worked as a psychiatrist consultant for 30 years? So the institutions I've studied, so just behind the tree there on the River Clyde is the Town's Hospital, where a sugar baron called Robert McNair was aware that mentally ill people were being shackled, and some of them were ladies and gentlemen. So he thought we need to build an asylum. And this was the asylum he built through his money from the sugar trade. Sugar, tobacco built Glasgow, cotton, etc. And this Stark's Asylum opened in 1814 in a greenfield site. And this stood where Glasgow Caledonian University stands now, their Govan Mbeki building. The students who know history in Glasgow Caledonian University talk about their university as the Looney Uni, rather demeaning, but Parliamentary Road in Dobbies Lawn, also near Strathclyde University, was the original asylum. And this was to last the people of Glasgow and the west of Scotland for 200 years. Within 20 years, it was filled to overflowing, and they had to relocate and rebuild. At the beginning of this asylum, they did not ask about patients' drinking habits. They weren't interested. They weren't making a connection necessarily between heavy drinking and lunacy. This says Robert McNair, founder of the hospital. It's in the place they relocated to, but he helped found the original hospital. It was public funded. They had a circus in George Square that raised money to build the asylum, which had 4 arms, 2 for upper class people, ladies and gentlemen, and one for pauper men and 1 for pauper women. The hospital relocated, and at the center of this image is where it is the building they built and opened in 1843 at Gartnavel. The other buildings around the West House and the East House there, the turrets are on the West House for ladies and gentlemen, Tudor Gothic design. The asylum owned all of the lands around there, which were green field. And by this point, when this opened in 1843, Queen Victoria had been on the throne for 6 years, her image on the wall there on the left. And Prince Albert, she married in 1840, his image on the right there. So very much a Victorian institution. And they were starting, and eventually that was replaced in 2007 by a brand new hospital that was designed along the lines of Stark's original asylum. And the 2 are connected by a wall. Historic Scotland wanted them to be connected. So I suppose I set out mainly to think, what was happening at the intersection of alcohol and psychiatry in this institution that is now 208 years old come this December. And we had a 200th celebration. But it was the first asylum in Glasgow, and then we started to build more asylums, district asylums in Argyllshire, other asylums around Glasgow, in Lanarkshire. And there was this huge program of building more and more psychiatric institutions, to the point that the commonest reason to be in an NHS bed after the advent of the National Health Service in the 1950s, the single diagnosis that filled most beds was schizophrenia. So we just kept building more and more, and more and more patients in an institutional environment. And the question is, was alcohol contributing to that particular rise in mental illness? And at the end of the 19th century, some of the alienist psychiatrists thought that was the case. Whoops, jumped forward. And I kind of look at that asylum numbers graph and try to relate it to the alcohol consumption graph. And there is, at the end of the 19th century, an increase in per capita consumption in Britain of alcohol. And there was a perception from these psychiatrists that alcohol was starting to play a role in the etiology of mental illness. Now, I'm about to dispute that. The other interesting thing, having looked at records in the infirmary and in the asylum in the 19th century, particularly at the Gartnavel Hospital, is this ever-changing terminology. William White, in his book Slaying the Dragon, in a prologue, talks about the problem of language, a professional Tower of Babel. And unlike David Koroskovsky, I've got his name wrong, hopefully, apologies, David. I think there wasn't a clear distinction between the underlying problem of inebriety, alcohol addiction, habitual drunkenness, and what it caused. So delirium tremens, up until Lexington, Kentucky sorted out the etiology, was thought to be a form of extreme intoxication rather than a withdrawal phenomenon, alcohol withdrawal delirium. And until those human guinea pig experiments, and that was the paper I gave in Shanghai, I think medicine was getting that cause and effect wrong. And we continue to play around with the terminology. So ICD-11, which we're introducing in Britain this year, is diverging from DSM-5. And perhaps DSM-5, rightly or wrongly, should have taken away the idea of the dependence syndrome. 19th century doctors in Glasgow in the mid-19th century were doing a lot of backache medicine. They were giving patients in the fever hospital. So if you had typhoid fever, the more ill you were, the more alcohol they would give you as a remedy, until someone showed, William Tennant Gairdner, professor of medicine, that the more alcohol you were given, the more likely you were to die. And if you weren't given alcohol, you were more likely to live. So doctors were still hanging on to alcohol as a medicine. But by the end of the 19th century, they jumped on board the temperance bandwagon. Not many doctors had joined up until the last quarter of the 19th century in Scotland, but many then started to become members. In the early asylum, so there was a man called Dr. Balmano, who visited the early asylum, at Glasgow Asylum for Lunatics that I showed you in the first slide. And he didn't think, unlike information he'd heard from Liverpool, that alcohol was causing much in the way of insanity. So where he's put D, he's thinking, well, drink alcohol maybe caused that person's insanity, and as always, men slightly outnumber women, or as you'll see later on, majorly outnumber women. Why has he put an asterisk against 1828? Because he was aware there was new mental health legislation, Madhouse Act, under George IV, that he thought should have closed down, and therefore he might see a rise in cases to his establishment, might have closed down the fact that drunkards in the west of Scotland were being put onto islands against their wishes in the early 19th century. And he felt this was illegal, and this new Madhouse Act made it illegal. But if you go to Luss on beautiful Loch Lomond side, there were two islands, and this is the parish minister describing this, where families made a living. And this is the language of 1834, boarding people who have been addicted to drinking, or boarding people given to intoxication. So I haven't been able to find out more about this, but there was some kind of coercive drying out going on here for these early 19th century alcohol patients. I'm going to jump forward a bit and tell you about this man, David Yowleys, who was physician superintendent, the Glasgow Royal Asylum at the end of the 19th century. I had a slightly surreal experience 2 weeks ago showing this man's great-great-grandson around Gartnavel campus. His great-great-grandson, Angus Yowleys, is an actor in something called Outlander, which some people might know about, but I can't say I've watched that TV series. But he was trying to find out about his grandfather, great-great-grandfather. He did know his great-great-grandfather believed that masturbation could cause insanity and had invented a pin to put in men's penises to stop them masturbating. Masturbatory insanity was only in men, and he would diagnose some as having that. So he wrote about insanity and intemperance, and he thought that maybe up to half the existing cases of insanity are due directly or indirectly to this social curse. He was very religious, very moral man. When he retired in 1901, they gave him an electric kettle so he could make tea and drink of the drink that stimulates but doesn't intoxicate. So I don't think he was teetotal, but he was kind of heading that way. But he originally went from Edinburgh, where he trained, to Wales, set up an asylum in Glamorgan, and believed that the miners were more likely to present at his asylum with insanity if they were working. They had more money to spend on drink. So ignorance and self-indulgence can make prosperity a curse instead of a blessing. But he had a sort of sophisticated view that alcohol could cause insanity, or it might be a symptom. So someone becomes manic and then they start drinking, or it may be a result. So you're insane first, and then you become intemperate. So he, in his time as a physician superintendent, went back over the records and tried to tabulate what percentage of the insane in his asylum. So he started in 1876, but he looked back to 1853, and what percent, and they published every year an annual report, were down to alcohol, and it was much higher than what Belmano was finding in those early years. And in fact, it was the single main cause that they attributed insanity to, and mainly in men, as you can see here. I tried to graph this. It does look a bit jerky, but with the eye of faith, I think if I should have smoothed it out and drawn a line. It does seem to go up at the end of the 19th century in terms of percentage, and then it goes away in the early 20th century when alcohol consumption was falling in the general population. So what other things would they attribute insanity to? So intemperance was the single main cause they wanted to pin it on. But you do see here masturbation. For men, their insanity put down to masturbation in 1896, but mainly 16 patients, it was put down to intemperance. And I don't think they thought of this necessarily in an absolute way. If you had previous attacks or if you had hereditary predisposition, this could interact. But when you try to pin down what they meant, what was the form of alcoholic insanity, there's a few cases of alcohol mania. Some of the DTs that Yellis tried to exclude, also known as mania apotus, snuck in. And then there's chronic alcoholic dementia. I mean, today we would see the main psychiatric consequence of sustained heavy drinking as being melancholy or depression. The American Mark Schuckett has described alcohol-induced major depression, but that was not what they were seeing in the asylum. Yellis tried to get the paupers out of Gartnavel at the end of the 19th century, sent them to the new district and parochial asylums. And he wanted his fee-paying patients to not be beside someone who was a demoralized drunkard. And he was arguing for separate inebriate reformatories. So this man was a pauper patient. He came into the hospital, possibly in the DTs, with a bit of sustained mental illness, but he stayed. They made him the hospital postman. They gave him a job for life, and he was known as the general or the postmaster general. So very much a total institution that you could become part of the staff. So he wanted to keep DTs out, but what did he think was alcohol insanity? And he really describes in this evidence to a parliamentary inquiry that alcohol insanity was a sort of paranoid state. The patient becomes suspicious, he hears things, whispering in his ears, he believes someone slandered his wife. So this is not what we would probably identify as an alcohol psychosis today, and alcohol psychosis is deemed to be very, very rare. So perhaps a misattribution to alcohol, which was common in the population at large, of something that maybe is an independent mental illness.
Ian, we have about 2 minutes left, sorry.
Okay, just wrapping up, yeah.
Okay, great.
At the end of the 19th century, the parochial and district asylums had a special inquiry into alcohol insanity. And very much the vogue of the time, degeneration theory comes in. So this increased drinking, increased mental illness, it was perceived could lead to the extinction of the race. So something had to be done about the social plague of alcoholism. There was one dissenting voice, Dr. Watson, who said, hang on a minute, Perhaps the prevalence of alcohol in the community is no different from that in the asylum, the use of alcohol. And maybe this is just coincidence. And, you know, I think today's knowledge would probably back that up. So last slide, Dan. So this man, famous British psychiatrist, Sir David Kennedy Henderson, main textbook of British psychiatry for over 40 years. Looking back, he died the following year, thought maybe they had misattributed psychosis to alcohol. He would allow maybe brain damage was in there, but that was not what these 19th century psychiatrists were describing. So I think from the perspective of today's psychiatry, I think this was a misattribution. You have to think this was a profession trying to stamp its mark. They wanted to be in on the alcohol temperance debate at the end of the 19th century. I think Dr. Watson of Hawkhead Asylum makes more sense to me reading back, and I'm aware I'm being anachronistic, but as a clinician, I go to history to try and see where I've come from, and I think for me this has certainly been a useful exercise. Okay, that's my talk.
Thank you. All right, thank you, Ian. Okay, we can see you. We're going to open it up to questions, and I guess if you two could share that mic, and you can have this mic. Patricia, questions? Yes.
Do I need a mic as well?
Do we have another mic? Let's go. Oh, he's coming with the mic. Hey, Ian, can you hear the room or just us when we're at the mic?
Not very well. No, I would
Okay,
need
we're getting a mic. They're coming with a portable mic. If you want, you can come up. Oh, here. Gracias. Yes.
And thank you to. Okay, is that on now?
Can you hear?
Can you hear me now?
Online?
Yeah.
Yeah. No. Yeah.
Okay, so thanks to all the panelists. Really, really interesting talks, all of them. My question was for Patricia. So looking at the periodization here, how does the suffrage movement at this point feature into your analysis? So you have women as wives and mothers, and the danger to that kind of role that narcotics represents. So for example, the Ladies' Home Journal saying to be wary of what the doctor gives you, which does cast women as actors with their own agency in the face of the medical profession. But I was wondering if you found anything on women as citizens rather than wives and mothers. So from something by Carrie Chapman Catt, or a bit later Alice Paul, those kinds of figures in the female suffrage movement. Any mentions from them or someone like that on narcotics for women?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, really, all of these movements intersect, and they're all functioning off of this basis, right, of exploiting society's understanding of women as the safeguarders of health and virtue and safety of the home, right, and extending that home out into the public sphere. From the philosophy of Francis Willard, who I've looked at a lot of her stuff, but yes, and suffragists for the most part. I've really just done a lot of work in regional organizations in the South. So Louisiana suffrage reformer Caroline E. Merrick has a lot to say about narcotics. She actually provides a personal anecdote of being just given loads of drugs by her physician for really no reason, or what she deems no reason. And so, yeah, I think there's major intersections here, and it is about exploiting these assumptions in order to gain some political leverage, right? but it comes at a cost, right? Because it reinforces these very restrictive and understandings of what is feminine and who is feminine, right? Like who has claim to that, obviously. So this is shrouded in whiteness and class specific notions. Yeah. I hope that answers your question.
Hi. Congratulations. I love the panel. Every single paper was, I really like it. But I have a question also for you, Patricia, that connects with that one, because what I was saying today in the morning in the round table about history, how we're writing history of drugs and alcohol, was that for me the biggest concern is that we are leaving out the intersection of race, class, and gender, and exactly related to that, because at the same time, those years, we have also women who are African American who are also practicing prostitution, and I'm pretty sure people are not blaming on the fact that the madame is giving something, first of all, because they are not in brothels, right? So and they are blamed for the agency of choosing that because they are immoral. Yes. So I wonder if you are in your dissertation including those or making comparisons on these different voices of women, or if you are using also, or probably it's outside of the scope of what you are working, but on criminal records of women who are going to prison for practicing prostitution, for example.
Yeah. No, it's a fabulous suggestion, and really the sex work component of my dissertation, I'm really just beginning to dive into. But yeah, you make an excellent point. And so yeah, this is definitely, these seduction narratives are based off of a fear of white women becoming corrupted, right? And that's just not assumed for women of color who are engaged in sex work. It's assumed that they're choosing this line of work. So absolutely right. And so up to now, just to be completely honest, I've incorporated Black voices in the form of Black activists. So Anna Julia Cooper, for example, and they also have much to say about narcotics wreaking havoc among the community. But no, that's certainly something to think about going forward. Thank you.
Scott.
Just to continue with Patricia. And you hear me?
Yes.
When does this constellation of values change? I'm sure it doesn't change all at once, but when do you see this sort of mentality really lifting and shifting?
Yeah, this is a really tricky question, right, about periodization and ideology, right? But I one of the key goals of my dissertation is to push that timeline backward. And because we're really focused on the 19 teens and the Harrison Act, I try to show that fear and condemnation and pathologization of women's drug use particularly really starts just after the Civil War, when people are beginning to realize that there is a problem. And so there's sort of, I would like to say there's a myth of the respectable addict that really went without scorn, that was, tolerated socially and just sort of accepted as, oh, she just needs her tonic, right? There's very, very early concern and very critical depictions of these women by women themselves oftentimes.
More questions? Oh, okay. Yeah, that first.
Thanks so much. I thought this was a great panel. I have a question for Katie. I was wondering if you had a sense of how people in Montana responded to Helen Moorhead. Like if I could imagine, this woman who's from like New York, DC, vacationing in Montana, comes in and has like all of these opinions about this more rural environment. And I was wondering if they had responses to that, if they were accepting of it, or if they complicated it, or if they rejected it or supported it.
That's a great question. I think in the rural spaces, I don't have an answer for that of like how inclusive they were to her messaging. I do know that she toured around to some different women's groups. They tended to be in like the little urban centers of Montana at the time. So I think in that capacity, very welcomed in to speak to these different groups. So there's definitely documentation of that. I don't know on the rural space, like how much of an issue this really felt like it was. I think it was centered in places like Butte, which was kind of Butte and Helena were really the only big urban centers at the time. The other were kind of agricultural outposts. So it's a great question. So.
Thank you.
Hi, thank you. I have a question for Ian. You started out telling us about ladies and gentlemen who were being shackled in these asylums, and then how they demanded a change, having separate wards, etc. But it made noise in my head to have these upper class people being shackled in the first place. So since when were they being interned together with people of different classes and being treated outside their homes, being treated in these sort of institutions? Thank you.
Yeah, thanks for the question. So this is a kind of standard story of the advent of moral treatment. So a place like the York Retreat, run by Quakers. So the original Glasgow Asylum wasn't particularly medicalized. The Balmano visited, but he didn't live in. So where the building on the Clyde, it was a town's hospital, so it was a general hospital, and it had this basement ward for people who were mentally disturbed. So if you were a gentleman or lady who was behaving oddly in public, and making a nuisance of yourself or uncontainable by your family, and in a kind of manic state, you would end up there. And this is what galvanized McNair, the sugar baron. He didn't think people of his class should be in amongst the poor class, shackled up. So that it's a kind of establishment story of what motivated him to build an asylum using moral treatment. So I didn't show you, but I've got pictures of the shackles from Paisleystown Hospital. So this was a similar story around Scotland, where we developed these big asylums to treat people initially through moral treatment, and not giving them medical treatments, although they snuck in like cupping and bloodletting and so on. We're still around. But...
Thank you. Miriam.
Hi, thank you. My question is for Josket. I really liked this research. I thought it was just really nuanced deconstruction of the alcohol industry's relationship to the discovery of cirrhosis. But my question is sort of about the international context. And I was wondering sort of where the British research agenda fit in with a sort of a wider global recognition of cirrhosis or interest in understanding its causes. Is there sort of parallel research going on in the US or anywhere else where sort of drinking was also emerging as a public health issue? Are researchers following similar questions or coming to different conclusions or funded in more or less the same way? I'm just curious to hear more about the international context.
Thanks for the question. Well, this is by this period, it's kind of there was already kind of an international milieu of scientists, constantly talking and referencing each other's work, and it's almost. I mean, it might be a bit callous, but it's kind of a borderless scientific milieu, I think. So a lot of the research on liver disease at the time was produced in the United States, and I mentioned a guy called Charles Lieber, but he was working for the VA in Brooklyn, Bronx, and there was in terms of like so Roger Williams was looking at gender, and he was also looking at genetics as a factor, but there were other researchers in the United States looking at race as a factor. I mean, there's a lot of research at the time in the 60s and the 70s done on how liver disease rates especially in relation to how much alcohol is consumed by that person. The likelihood of developing cirrhosis is much higher among, say, Native Americans, among African Americans as well. So I think there's his research was, I would definitely say, was definitely part of that agenda. In terms of the funding context, this is even more interesting. I think it might be part of my next project, but the Brewers Society, the one I just mentioned, the organization I mentioned, directly collaborates with equivalent organizations in the United States, in Canada, in Australia, not New Zealand, I think, but these three Anglophone countries. And because the public health agenda was a global thing, it was a WHO reports that brought it out. There was a real effort by brewers from different countries they really wanted to stamp this agenda out because it has international implications. So I hope I answered that question. Thank you.
Oh, I'm sorry. Yeah, go. Yeah, Ava, go first because you're closer to the mic. You have proximity priority.
Yeah. So mine's for Katie, and I wanted to ask if you came across anything similar to the story of Helen Howell Moorhead, but about Elizabeth Washburn Wright, so sort of her contemporary and less popular figure in international drug diplomacy circles. So anything related to her that you've come across? I mean, in Montana or elsewhere, really.
Yeah. No, great question. She has not come up in any thing I've searched through in Montana. It would be pretty rare, I would guess, to find it. But actually, I was talking with Matthew Pimpleton, who's a historian as well, and with American University, and he has an article that has been brewing for many years on his side, that's on the side of his desk, that is kind of in this vein about these women that have not really been highlighted as much. So he's probably a great resource to see where else Wright has been involved. So I know he's worked in that a little bit.
On that note, actually, tell him to get in touch with Bill McAllister if he's found anything on Elizabeth Wright, your papers or anything.
Okay.
He's kind of hard to come across.
Yeah. We'll do. Yeah, I know he's got stuff. So.
Actually, yes. My question was also for you, but I was thinking about Moorhead as have you come across in your research if she gave voice to those women who had no voice, but were the mothers or the wives of people who were affected by the prescription of these drugs, or I don't know, or it was just only that she was witnessing and she came with this because of her volunteering work, comes and sees and start talking, or it's also an intersection with what she hears from other women in the area?
It's a great question. I have yet to travel to any archives to look at sort of the local women's groups records, because I think that's where it would come up. What I can gather from what I've seen so far, it's more talking to the leadership. But I would imagine that my guess would be that there's some connection with what she witnessed in her early work of working with addicts, and then an interest, rather than just being on prevention and education, something with the families. I haven't come across it, but I'd be curious to know if, and then I'm looking to she doesn't really have an archive. So some of her records with the Foreign Policy Association are with that archive in Wisconsin. but that's really specific to the foreign policy work she did. A little bit comes across on some of her personal records, like if she's writing a letter to somebody while she's on a trip, she writes about her family, for example. But I haven't found anything there that is specific to your question. But it's a great point of sort of, I'm fascinated with what drives her, right, to like what is underneath all of that. Is it just from that experience she had in New York? Is it her time with the Red Cross? I haven't looked at the Red Cross records either, because it's warranted a trip to DC that I haven't done yet. So it might be there, but it hasn't come to the surface yet. It's a great point.
Cool. I want to take a chair's privilege and ask Rio a question before I see more hands clap. I'm really fascinated with the idea of bias in science and funding. And there's this erroneous notion that public health funding is unbiased, right? And so we see this with the brewing industry and the tobacco industry, is we look at their funding and go, oh, well, they clearly had an agenda, which they did, right? Because they were vested interests. So when you started to talk about this idea of this multivariate causation of liver disease, was there anyone outside of the liquor industry who said, you know what, we should look at these things and we should ask these questions? Was there any push against this very hard public health agenda apart from the voices of the liquor industry, or was the liquor industry actually just trying to manifest voices that were silenced, like voices of drinkers, right? Drinkers tended not to say too much; they just would vote with their money. Do you know what I'm asking? And I'll give the context of this is in the late 19th century with the temperance movement, the liquor industry reacted by saying, we believe in true temperance, right? Which is moderation. And they did offer an alternative, but they were seen as biased, whereas the temperance industry was seen as not like pure, right? And yet they were paid to do their talks, and there was an industry, So no worries.
So I'm kind of this school of people who really see a kind of an ideological, traditional, and obviously an institutional connection between the public health people that emerged in the 70s and the old temperance movement.
Yeah.
And often it's the same organizations, like the Institute of Alcohol Research, is the UK Alliance. UK Alliance, by the way, was the biggest prohibitionist organization in the 19th century. It's now an NGO that funds alcohol research. A lot of good research, by the way. Not nevertheless. I think at the same time I have to stress that on one side of the debate, I think it is heavily driven by profit, right? And driven by the profit motive. And on the other side, I mean, I think people get into health activism for a variety of reasons, but I think part that there is an element of it where there is a genuine concern for health. I mean, and there's also, of course, a kind of a moral condemnation of a certain kind of drinking practices, I think. Trying to think of the second part of your question.
I can't remember it now either, but about the multivariate causation, because in one sense, you do say that the drinks industry was actually kind of interested in real research and interested in sort of offering a scientific counterbalance to what was sort of a neo-prohibitionism, right? Or at least a neo-temperance thing. So how did that multivariate approach, how do people respond to that, I guess?
So, I mean,
multi-causation.
The multi-causation, so I kind of mentioned very briefly, Roger Williams' research, especially on gender, is one of the main reasons why. So in Britain, they measure alcohol by units, and it was suggested in Department of Health report, which was one of the kind of the manifestos of the public health people, in 1984, I think, that women should not drink more than 11 units of alcohol per week, and men 21. And the reason why this difference is, there's a citation to that leads to Roger Williams' paper. So the public health movement wasn't necessarily, they didn't reject his research. They actually quite acknowledged it and actually integrated it into their advice. And this is despite the fact that his research was actually funded by the brewing industry. So the funding bias part is, I think, I really tried to look for any evidences that he paid any kind of maybe not ideological, but some sort of lip service to the brewing industry, but I couldn't find anything.
So like he wasn't putting his thumb on the scales.
Yeah. So I think my conclusion is that I think the funding obviously initially happened because of connections. And Roger Williams, I think, being a very intelligent guy, I actually interviewed him, and the reason why I know that it was through personal connections is because through the interview he told me that, I had this friend who was a patient of mine. He was a guy called Keith Sowering, and then I found in the archives that Derek Holden Brown was the guy who co-opted the funding. Then I found out later on in a different archive that Derek Holden Brown works under Keith Sowering. So yeah.
Good. That's great. And we probably have time for one more. We should wrap it up just a touch early, but I wonder if there are any other questions for Ian, because he's out there over in Scotland and waiting intently. No.
I'll just have a comment for you, Ian. I was trying to find it on my computer, couldn't find it, but I have somewhere on some paper some research I found. I was trying to look at the influence of the U.S. experience in the Philippines on like leading into some of our narcotics laws, and there was some great quote about these Protestant missionaries there and the influence of seeing opium there. But they said it wasn't as crazy to them as the streets of Glasgow on a Friday night or something like that. So I was looking for this quote and I couldn't find it, but it made me appreciate Glasgow a little bit more.
It's a good city. All right. Well, thank you, Katie. Thank you, Ian, for coming back. And again, as the sun is just on the horizon still. Thanks to everybody. What's that? Do you have a response to Katie's information about?
No,
Okay. Right. It is a real. Okay. Anyway, we have to wrap it up, and I have to give, before we thank everyone, I do have to give some housekeeping. Eric has informed me that the buses are going to be leaving about at 5:30. So if you do want to take the bus, don't linger. I just got a text from that. So Ian, you don't have to worry about that. Your bus issue, it might be different. But before everyone races off, please join me in thanking this panel for a fantastic panel. And that's the last session until the tequila sunset. Take care, Ian. It's good to see you again.
Good to see you. I'm off to have a whiskey rather than.
Yeah, he's gone.